Hi everybody, welcome to Langer at the mic. I'm Mike Langer. The Montreal Canadiens got wrecked by the Carolina Hurricanes last night. They got outshot 50-14. They got outpossessed. The Hurricanes spent, I believe it was over 34 minutes of the game in the Montreal Canadiens zone. They dominated in the face-off circle. The Hurricanes did over the Habs, 61% to 39%. Right now, the Carolina Hurricanes are clearly a Stanley Cup contender in a loaded Eastern Conference, whereas the Montreal Canadiens clearly are not. A big reason why the Hurricanes are contenders is because of their depth at center between Sebastian Aho, Jordan Staal, yes, Jesperi Kotkaniemi, and even Paul Stastny and Derek Stepan, who plays on the wing on the fourth line, but he could also play at center for good measure. The Habs, on the other hand, in terms of who is healthy, they just have Nick Suzuki, and that is all right now. Christian Dvorak, Sean Monahan, Kirby Dach, everyone that was basically supposed to round out the depth chart at center is out with injury right now. Heck, even Jake Evans got banged up in yesterday's game. While their center depth right now doesn't matter because the season's a write-off anyway and they're pushing for a top 5 pick, but it will matter, of course, when the Montreal Canadiens are going to try to contend again. But our question for today is about Nick Suzuki. Is he good enough to lead that charge at center? Is Nick Suzuki a true franchise #1 center? And if not, will he ever become one? But before we can answer that question, we must first provide a lot of context, which is why we're going to start with why Nick Suzuki is a #1 center in the NHL. Not just because he's the Habs captain and because he's #1 on the Habs depth chart by default, but why Nick Suzuki is legitimately a franchise #1 center in the NHL. Well, with that being said, as the captain and #1 center by default on a bottom 5 Habs team, Nick Suzuki is literally expected to do everything. He's expected to generate offense while playing against the other team's top line. He's expected to play on the power play, play on the penalty kill. Suzuki averages 1 minute and 36 seconds of ice time per game on the penalty kill, which is less than Alexander Barkov, Mika Zibanejad, Patrice Bergeron, Elias Lindholm, Anze Kopitar, Dylan Larkin, Sebastian Aho, Patrice Bergeron, and Logan Couture. However, that is more than Connor McDavid, Bo Horvat, Evgeny Kuznetsov, Leon Draisaitl, Tage Thompson, Jack Eichel, Steven Stamkos, Thomas Hertl, Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Matthew Barzal, John Tavares, and Austin Matthews. Nick Suzuki also starts 16% of his shifts in the defensive zone, which is less than Anze Kopitar, Bo Horvat, Elias Pettersson, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Logan Couture, Alexander Barkov, Mika Zibanejad, Elias Lindholm, and Patrice Bergeron, but more than Dylan Larkin, Leon Draisaitl, Connor McDavid, Jack Eichel, John Tavares, Nicholas Backstrom, Thomas Hertl, Evgeny Kuznetsov, Nathan MacKinnon, Tage Thompson, and Austin Matthews. But here's the real kicker. Nick Suzuki averages over 21 minutes of ice time per game. That is 4th among centers, 4th, only behind Connor McDavid, Nathan MacKinnon, and Leon Draisaitl. All this to say, Nick Suzuki has a pretty substantial defensive and penalty killing burden. It's not the most substantial defensive responsibility, but it's still significantly more than many other NHL greats like Crosby, McKinnon, McDavid, and Draisaitl, etc. Again, Suzuki is expected to do literally everything, and he still managed to put up 23 goals and 61 points in 76 games this season, which is a career high for him in goals and only 1 point away from a career high in points. And oh, by the way, he is still only 23 years old. Suzuki has also been a true Ironman. He has never missed a game yet in his career, even though he admitted to playing through injury earlier this season. And look at the line mates that Suzuki has had to play with throughout many parts of this season. Guys like Hoffman, Ulonen, Anderson. Respectable offensive players, sure, but definitely not first-line caliber players, especially since Suzuki has been without Cole Caulfield over 30% of the time since Caulfield suffered a season-ending shoulder injury earlier in January. All this to say, Nick Suzuki has a robust workload, averaging the 4th highest ice time among NHL centers, playing in all situations, oftentimes not having the benefit of playing with good line mates, and despite that, he is extremely durable and has not missed a game in his entire NHL career. It's fair to say that all those factors have impacted his efficiency metrics, but imagine if Suzuki could benefit from a full season with a Dvorak or Evans or eventually a Pierre-Luc Dubois perhaps, or maybe a developed Owen Beck. or any other actual NHL center playing behind him that can lessen his workload and allow him to improve on his overall offensive efficiency. For all those reasons, Nick Suzuki is a legitimate #1 franchise center in the NHL, or at the very least will become one once he has the benefit of maturing a little bit more and playing on a more complete team. Now let's talk about why Nick Suzuki is not a franchise #1 center in the NHL, and this discussion is a little bit shorter and simpler. For starters, his 61 points rank him at 34th among NHL centers, which is outside the top 32. He's had several stretches this season of going 3 to 5 games without recording a single point. He should be expected to carry the offense more independently regardless of his line mates. His 2.7 points per 60 minutes are 143rd for those with over 400 minutes of ice time or more, which is just slightly over half of what Connor McDavid has at 5 points per 60 and less than the 3 points per 60 mark, which is kind of a cutoff for other elite NHL centers. Suzuki's efficiency in the faceoff circle is still at under 50%, which is not ideal for a center who is expected to play in all situations. And lastly, there are indeed over 20 centers who I think we could both agree on that we would take objectively over Nick Suzuki. I have Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews, Leon Draisaitl, Nathan MacKinnon, Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Steven Stamkos, Alexander Barkov, Sebastian Aho, Mika Zibanejad, Braden Point, Patrice Bergeron, Jack Hughes, Tage Thompson, Nicholas Backstrom, Matthew Barzal, Anze Kopitar, Dylan Larkin, Jack Eichel, and Elias Pettersson as 20 centers who I would objectively take over Nick Suzuki. And you could possibly even list more. Bottom line is, Nick Suzuki may have the upside, he may have the tools, but as of right now, you can argue that he is not consistent enough to be considered a legitimate franchise #1 center. So now that we looked at both sides of the coin, is Nick Suzuki a franchise #1 center? And my answer to that is it all depends on what your definition is of a franchise #1 center. Do you consider a franchise center to be a generational talent, a point per game player, a two-way 70-point player, or simply someone you can win a Stanley Cup with as your first line center? If your answer is that last part, well then Ryan O'Reilly, Braden Point, Nicholas Backstrom, Jonathan Toews, Anze Kopitar, and David Krejci are all franchise centers by that definition because they've all won Stanley Cups as first-line centers, even though they might be considered all-stars but not generational talents. And yes, David Krejci averaged more ice time than Patrice Bergeron when the Bruins won the Stanley Cup in 2011. So in my opinion, I say that Nick Suzuki is a legitimate franchise center, or at the very least will become one when all is said and done. Because while he's not Connor McDavid or Nathan MacKinnon or Sidney Crosby, Suzuki is more than capable of leading equally good players around him, just like he did with Cole Caulfield and Kirby Dach, and just like he did in the Habs run to the Cup final in 2021. The key is to build a great team around him to lessen his defensive responsibilities and maximize his offensive potential. Just imagine how much more effective Nick Suzuki can be with a Cole Caulfield or Kirby Dach on his line for a more complete season, and if say a Pierre-Luc Dubois was right there with him on the depth chart, or a Will Smith, or dare I say a Connor Bedard or Adam Fantilli, heck, even just simply a healthy Christian Dvorak or Jake Evans or a Sean Monahan for a more complete season. Well, that's all for this video. Now, do you agree or disagree with the notion that Nick Suzuki is a legitimate franchise #1 center? Let me know in the comment section below. But as usual, hit like, hit subscribe, give me a follow on Twitter and Instagram at Mike Langer for both. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again next time.